All right, everyone. Welcome to the first session in our four-part series on developing JavaScript applications with the Microsoft Identity Platform. Today, really excited to sit down virtually and talk to you all about how we can authenticate users in our JavaScript applications with the MSAL.js library. First, I'm going to do some housekeeping before we really get too deep. I'm Sydney Andrews. I'm an Azure MVP and a Microsoft Certified Trainer. We have on Q&A Aisha, who's going to help answer any of your questions. And if I mispronounced your name, I apologize. As with all the other webinars we've ever done, msusdev at Microsoft.com is our alias if you want to access any questions that you feel like didn't get answered in the Q&A today. If you got questions today you want to answer right now, go in the Q&A. Again, we got experts in the Q&A. They've already been answering some great questions. We also have a GitHub repo, github.com, msusdev is the organization, and Microsoft_Identity Platform Dev is the repo. And I think this link was already posted in the Q&A. So if you just go over to the Q&A, check it out, you'll see the link. The entire presentation I'm showing you today, plus all of the demos are there now for you to go in, play around with, show to your colleagues, and go and have fun. So let's set the scene. This is the first out of 4 sessions we're going to do about JavaScript in particular with Microsoft Identity Platform. Today, we're going to set the stage. We're going to talk about how we can authenticate in our JavaScript application. Specifically, I'll show you a Node application using that MSAL.js library. We're going to go over the basics of authentication with the Microsoft Identity Platform, and we're going to implement it. The next session, we're going to go into the Microsoft Graph Toolkit components. After that, we'll talk about authenticating Azure with MSAL.js. And then the final session will be how we can use the Graph SDK together with MSAL.js. So with all that out the way, really 4 things we're going to try and tackle today. We're going to try to define and talk about what the Microsoft Identity Platform is at a very high level. And then I'm going to do what's one of my favorite things to do is just to authenticate manually. I feel like once you see somebody manually authenticate, it will reveal all mysteries, answer all questions, and make everyone at a level set so that when we start using MSAL.js library, it's not magic, it's not a mystery how it works. Everybody really understands how it works underneath the hood, and it helps us all out as we work with the platform. And that's really going to be the last 2 things. We're going to use the MSAL library to help us authenticate, and then we're going to figure out that token that we get from the MSAL library, what we can use it with. So with all that being said, I really want to start off by just going into the Microsoft Identity Platform. And so again, 2 goals today. We're going to manually authenticate. We're going to use the browser, and we're going to use a tool. I like to use Postman, but you can use any HTTP request tool to do this. And then we're going to do the same exact thing with the Microsoft Authentication Library. So we're going to see me run through the same demos 2 different times. But before we do any demos, we really need to talk about what the Microsoft Identity Platform is. And so one of the things that helped me really understand was to just look at this diagram, which somebody showed to me, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago. Essentially, everything we use in our organization is tied together with identity. So if we sign into cloud applications like Box.com, Salesforce, we tie into first-party cloud applications like Microsoft 365, Azure. If we're using applications in our offices, if we're using applications remotely, even logging into our individual devices or communicating with people in our company, the one thing that ties everything together is identity. So identity essentially becomes a control plane for our cloud experiences across the entire board. And the idea here is just super interesting, but we have one thing that ties everything together. So if we want to integrate all of these different components, if we want to take our own premises applications and bring in intelligence from the cloud, or if we want to take our communication applications that we use locally and tie it together with really unique devices, whether devices we purchase from a company or devices we build ourselves, the way we tie all this together is really understanding how identity works. So identity is really the core to integration. So if you've ever done identity in Microsoft's cloud before, you probably already heard of Azure Active Directory. And Azure Active Directory is really an identity service provided by Microsoft that helps you tie in all these different components, whether it's components from third-party clouds, from the Microsoft cloud, devices you may use, applications you may build, applications you may adopt. Azure Active Directory becomes this control plane across all these different experiences across the cloud. Now, this is interesting because in the past, you could definitely write code against Azure Active Directory. We had the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL, and it worked. That's I know some people worked really hard on it, but I always joke that it was just very difficult. It was one of those things that if you looked up a code sample on how to authenticate the Azure Active Directory, and I think sometimes if you still go in your search engine of choice and look for a code sample, you'll see that some of the sample code out there is just very difficult to parse. You'd see a sample here, how to quickly authenticate to Azure Active Directory in JavaScript, and it's 300 lines of code. And I mean, ADAL worked, but the barrier to entry is just so high. It was so difficult to get people to try it out for the first time, to get organizations to adopt it, or even more importantly, even if you do adopt it, it was hard to understand what was really going on, hard to maintain it. And so while it technically worked, there was a need for something more. So two things really happened. One was the actual endpoints and the API, they all standardized, and we came up with this thing with the Microsoft Identity Platform, which is essentially this one platform for all the identity development you want to do across all of Microsoft. And when we say all identities, I'm going to get into this a little bit deeper later, but more than just your organizational account. And the great thing about the Microsoft Identity Platform is that now there's this one API, one specification, one way to do things. People could build really compelling libraries. Both engineers, really awesome engineers at Microsoft, could build libraries that were really easy to use. People outside of Microsoft could build integrations and libraries and tools because, again, you have a unified API now. And so the ADAL library and then the API endpoints it pointed to, they still exist. We call that the 1.0 endpoint. It's still out there. If you build an application on it, it's still going to work. Everything's going to be fine. But moving forward, we have the Microsoft Identity Platform, which represents that 2.0 endpoint. And that 2.0 endpoint is great because we can use that to connect to all different types of accounts, whether they're accounts in Azure Active Directory or accounts I like to refer to as work or school accounts. Officially, I think they're referred to as organizational accounts. You have your personal or consumer accounts, which is like the account you use for Xbox or any type of Outlook.com or Live account. Or you have your social accounts, so social media providers, any other OAuth certified identity provider that you're using with tools such as Azure AD B2C. All of these are exposed through a single endpoint. So once you learn how to work with this 2.0 endpoint, then that can cover pretty much the majority of your identity needs. And on top of having a great endpoint now, there's now the Microsoft Authentication Library, or MSAL, which is a set of libraries across different programming languages and frameworks that already are set up to work with this endpoint in the simplest way possible using code in a much more concise fashion. We're talking hundreds of lines down to a couple of lines here. So let's actually look at that documentation page, because after this webinar is over, you're probably going to want to dig in and say, okay, I'm really excited about the Microsoft Identity Platform. Where do I go to learn more? And my goal is to show you how to do that. So I'm going to show my taskbar real quick, or I might have to exit this presentation. And I have a browser open, and I'm going to go to docs.com or docs.com. That's Microsoft's documentation homepage. Now for docs.com, I'm going to select Azure. And there's lots of stuff here for Azure, but the one I'm mostly interested in is Identity and Azure Active Directory. Now, this is going to take me to the landing page for all of Azure Active Directory. But if you're somebody who actually wants to learn about development, I can jump to the landing page for the Microsoft Identity Platform. So hit See More here. And this page is the landing page for Microsoft Identity Platform. So I'm going to make an announcement in the Q&A and just share this hyperlink with everyone. You'll see it at the top of the Q&A, and I think Matt already beat me to it. Darn. But it's in there twice now, so it's twice as nice. You're going to be able to jump in and look at that URL. And then the great thing about this page is this gives you just one place to sit, look through all the documentations for the platform that you prefer, the scenarios that are interesting to you. every tutorial I'm going to walk, or every demo I'm going to walk you through today is based on a tutorial from this page. So as you look through the documentation, you're going to say, wow, that looks extremely familiar. And that's because that's by design. I want you to be able to walk through these tutorials on this webpage and see that there's lots of really useful information there. Now, going back to our presentation, I'm going to just jump right back in. One of the first things I want to talk about is how we actually authenticate. So the very core thing we need to do is set up an application in Azure Active Directory. So we register these applications ahead of time, and this allows us to authenticate against Azure Active Directory and then to acquire tokens from Azure Active Directory. And those tokens, because there's a trust relationship between Azure Active Directory and the other applications we want to access, those tokens are essentially the keys to the kingdom that allow us to go to another application and grab the resources we need. So usually when we register our application, we include what's called a redirect URI. This is telling Azure AD that once we authenticate, this is where we need you to send us with all the tokens and credentials we need. Now, once we register, we'll get client credentials, specifically a client ID, that we're going to need that to actually set up the authentication. And you'll see today that we'll register 2 different types of applications, but it's more than just those 2 different types of applications. There's lots of applications you can register in Azure Active Directory. You can build web APIs. You can build standard client-facing web applications. You can build single-page applications that do everything in JavaScript, including the authentication and acquiring a token. You can build desktop and mobile applications that handle everything in-app. You can even build server-side applications where excuse me, we've built server-side applications where we want to set up credentials ahead of time so it can run in an unattended manner. So let's actually look at how we can register an application in Azure AD. So I'm going to jump out of this presentation real quick, and I'm going to go right back to my browser, and we're going to go to portal.azure.com. Now, from here, we're going to jump into Azure Active Directory, and just for your information, I'm logged in using a fictional identity. This is a fictional company I set up, and I love using it for webinars. Now, from this fictional company, I'm going to just jump in, and I'm going to go to App Registrations. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more. Now, I'm going to create a new registration, and I'm going to call this an example. Now, this registration, I'm going to set it up for some of the demos I'm doing later. So there's a couple options I need to pick. The first option is, hey, who can use this application or access this API if it's an API? Now, if I leave it to the default option, accounts in this organizational directory only, that means only people in my organization, the current Azure AD directory, can access this application. Now, if I want to allow any type of organizational account, whether it's in my directory or in another directory, I can select the multi-tenant option down here. If I want to combine the ability to allow people to access it across multiple directories and across their personal Microsoft accounts, then I will select this last option. Today, I'm just going to select the multi-tenant option. The last option down here is the redirect URI. Now, you don't have to set this up right now, but I'm going to set it up just for fun. So we're going to build, well, build's the wrong term here. We're going to authenticate manually first. And so technically, I'm doing a native authentication. So I'm going to set a redirect URI. And I'm going to say, you know what? Keep it simple. Let's redirect to localhost. That's all I want to do. Now, I don't have anything running at localhost. I'm going to just double check. You always say that, and you find out something's running. Yep, I don't have anything running at localhost, so we should be good to go. I'm going to hit register. And now I have an application registration. There's my client ID right there. I'm going to copy that to the clipboard. And now I can use this to go ahead and set up things. So let's actually jump back to the presentation. Let me walk you through what we're going to try and do manually. So before we get started authenticating manually, we really need to understand how we authenticate. And the process we use to actually authenticate is called an authentication flow. Now, this is a long table. Don't expect you to read it all, memorize it all. Again, this is why I gave you the link to the presentation at the beginning. But essentially, our authentication flows are the methods that we use to authenticate. So, for instance, authorization code allows our application to actually securely obtain the token. This is usually used with client-side applications. We have a device code authentication flow, implicit. We can use integrated Windows identities. We can even use a username password flow. And I'd like to walk you through 2 examples to really nail this point down. So first, we have our interactive authentication flow. And this is the one you've probably seen 100 times. We have an application, and we need to log in. So the application sends the user to some website hosted or ran by Azure Active Directory. The user logs in. Azure Active Directory sends them back to the redirect URI, which is usually on the same application. There's some exceptions there. And then once they get back, we use the token that we received on that redirect, whether it's part of a form post or part of a query string parameter, and then we go to whatever service we want to go to. And today, just to keep things simple, we're just going to go to the Microsoft Graph. Now, there's other flows, and I always like to keep some simple examples going. One of the example flows that you'll see is the device code flow. And this one's fun because essentially, just imagine you had an IoT device. I've actually had to implement this on an application I run on my Raspberry Pi. Now, with this IoT device, we can't necessarily go to the browser, especially if it's a headless device or a device without a graphical UI. So in a device code flow, the device goes get a unique code. Then the user uses some other workstation, maybe a computer, laptop, or even a mobile device nearby. And they go to the Azure Active Directory website, maybe even put in a URL manually. They put in the code they got from the device, they authenticate, and then Azure Active Directory will return the token to the device directly. And the device can use that token to move forward to whatever API you want to access. So a really good example of this is, I don't know if anybody remember the early days of the Azure CLI, where it said, hey, here's your device code. You need to go to Microsoft.com device login. And once you go to Microsoft.com device login, you put in your device code, and then you authenticate that way. This is the same exact flow. So when we actually decide to log in, well, we have one URL to rule them all, and that's our base URL for logins and queries, or requests, excuse me. So login.microsoftonline.com is where we're going to go. And then we need to provide a tenant ID, go to the OAuth 2 relative path, and then the version 2.0, i.e. the Microsoft Identity Platform's 2.0 endpoint. Now, there's specific actions we can take. Like, for instance, if we want to log in, we'll go to the authorize relative URL. Or if we want to just get a token, we'll go to the token relative URL. Now, there's a couple parts of this I want to walk through before we actually do this. The first part is the actual tenants. So when you create an Azure Active Directory, you get a unique tenant ID that's really just for your organization. That's a GUID, and you can provide that as part of this URL. Now, if you do that, when you go to log in, it'll automatically assume whoever's trying to log in as part of your organization. It'll even show within the login portal the theme and branding for your Azure Active Directory tenant. Now, what if you weren't sure if the person is part of your team or organization? Well, there's a couple of, I like to call them aliases that allow you to reference other things. So for example, if we use organizations, then it'll take them to a special login page only for organizational accounts. So think about your work or school accounts. This is useful if you don't know if it's going to be somebody from your organization or maybe one of the partner organizations you work with. Another endpoint is the consumer's endpoint. This is a special endpoint that's just for somebody with a Microsoft account. So think about if you're building something to interact with Xbox or any type of the Microsoft account features, you would go to the consumer's endpoint, or excuse me, consumer's tenant. And then the other alias common is just for any type of account, whether it's organizational or consumer account. So how do we authorize? Well, we go to that authorized endpoint that we talked about earlier at login.microsoftonline.com, and we get the correct query string parameters. There's lots of parameters here that we have to provide, and I'm going to go over them in a second in another slide. We then log in using our browser, and then we look at the response from the server. It's going to give us a response, whether we choose to get that response on a query string or as part of a form post. So let's actually look at those parameters. There's 5 parameters that we need to provide, and there's a 6th one if we decide to provide it. The first one is the client ID. That's that unique identifier that I showed you when we registered the AAD application. Then there's a response type. What are we asking for back? Here, the answer is usually code. Then we need to tell it the redirect URI, where to go after authentication. It's going to check to make sure that that redirect URI is one of the approved ones you set up when you registered the application. After that, we have the response mode. When it redirects back to the website in the redirect URI, do we want it to send the code on the query string, or do we want it to actually do a form post of the code? After that, we specify the scope. What permissions are we requesting from the APIs that we're accessing? So today we're going to keep it simple. We're going to use the Microsoft Graph. So we'll use really simple permissions from there. But if you're using other third-party applications, other Azure services, or even your own custom applications, the scope is really up to you. It's whatever you want it to be. Finally, there's a state. Now, the state is really interesting because you don't have to use it. But if you do use it, it's a way for you to check that the response is echoing the correct state back to you. So again, it's optional, but if you do use it, it should echo it back to you. So an authorization request, for example, and I'm going to open my pen real quick, would have our tenant. So here we want organizational accounts. We're going to the authorize endpoint. We're providing a client ID, response type of code, a redirect URI, which is URL encoded. What type of response we want. So here we say a query string. Our scope, we just want to read the user profile. So user.read is good. And then some state data. Now our response will redirect to whatever our redirect URI. So we said HTTP localhost. So that's where it redirects. It gives us a GUID for the code. And then it echoes our state back. Now, once we're done with that, we just take the same data and go to the token endpoint. But this time we're doing a post request instead of a GET. We put that client ID in the body, we put a redirect URI in the body, and our scope in the body. So those ones we already know. The code is what we just got from the authorized endpoint. And then the only unique one is grant type. Here we say we want to OAuth a bearer token authorization code. So something we can put in a bearer token header. And that's exactly what it's going to give us back. It's going to give us a JSON object with that bearer token, and we can take that bearer token to the service of our choice. So same parameters we're talking about here. I apologize, this should say form body properties, but get a typo, right? And then it will return a response. Now, I'm skipping past this because I actually want to show you this manually. I think it'll be way more interesting to look at how this actually works out. So I'm going to jump out of PowerPoint. And what I'm going to do is I have my application registration here. So I have my client ID. And so for fun, I'm going to open up Postman. Now, why am I opening up Postman right now? Postman has this really cool tool that helps you build out a URL. So I can open up Postman and build a GET request to https login.microsoftonline.com. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. I'm looking at the view and it's not zoomed in quite enough. I'm just going to go to the organizations endpoint. I'm going to go OAuth 2 version 2.0 and I want to authorize. Now from here, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. From here, I can actually use this little pane to build out my request. So my client ID, I already have that. I'm going to paste it in. I'll redirect URI. That's HTTP localhost. My scope is going to be user.read. My response type, I want a code back. And how do I want that code? Well, I want it in the query string, so I'll just use query. Now, because I use Postman here, it actually built the URL out for me. So I'll copy that, go to my browser, still trying to load localhost, go to paste it and hit enter. Now I'm already logged in, but just for fun, let's see if I can, just gonna log out real quick just so you can see what the login experience looks like. Am I logged out? All right, looks like I'm logged out. Perfect. So I'm gonna go in. or I didn't log out. That's all right. I have a really cool tool I can use here. And for those who don't know this, in Edge, you can actually browse as a guest. It's not quite incognito mode. It just allows you to use a different identity. So it's pretty great if you're playing around with Azure AD and the identity platform, because it allows me to just open up as many windows as I want with different identities. I'm just going to paste in that URL this time, and now I get to sign in. So I'm going to put in my email, hit next, and now it's identified the company I'm a part of. So it shows my login page for that company. I'm going to put in my password. And now, because this is my first time using this application, you all saw me spin up this application brand new. I need to give this application permissions to do the things I asked for in the scope. So in the scope, I asked for permission to do user.read, so read my user profile. So here it is, sign you in and read your profile and maintain access to this data I've given it access to. Now, since I'm a administrator for my directory, I could consent on behalf of the entire organization, or I can just go ahead and just consent for myself. And it's even warning me that this is an application that's not published by Microsoft, it's published by somebody else. And there's all my information there. I'm gonna hit accept, and it's gonna redirect me to localhost. Now, fortunately for us, I don't have anything running at localhost, but you notice I have this long query string. So I'm going to copy this and jump back into Postman. Now we can use Postman both ways. I can paste this URL into the Git, and it found two query strings. One is code and one is session state. So I didn't provide a state, so it didn't echo a state back. But I did ask for a code, and it sure enough gave me a code. So I'm going to copy this code. It's going to become really interesting later. Now, remember, we go to authorize endpoint for the user to authorize, but if we need a token, we have to go to the token endpoint. So I'm going to go back to Postman, and I'm going to build a post request. So HTTPS login microsoftonline.com organizations OAuth to v2.0, and this time I'm going token instead of authorize. Now, my information needs to be in the body of this request, and I actually like to submit it as form data. So I'm going to go in and put in my code and paste that code that I just copied. I'm going to go grab my client ID, that I used earlier. My redirect URI, I don't need to copy paste that. I remember that. That's HTTP localhost. My scope is user.read, and then remember we only had one property that we had to remember for this is grant type. And I want an authorization code that I can use in OAuth on bearer token header. So if I did everything right, I hit send, and there we go. I have a bearer token now. Let's copy this bearer token. So I want to go somewhere with this. In the interest of being fast about this, I'm going to go to aka.ms/ge. That's the URL to the Microsoft Graph Explorer. aka.ms/ge, and I just put that in the chat. Now, if I want to get my profile information, I can hit get my profile, and it'll pull profile information. I'm not logged in, so it pulls it for a fictional user. But if I sign into the Graph Explorer, it will actually pull my profile information. So I know to get to that, I need to go to graph.microsoft.com/v1.0/me. So just like we did earlier, HTTPS graph.microsoft.com v1.0/me. Now for my authorization, I'm going to do a bearer token, and I did one earlier. Here's my new bearer token. Hit send, and it successfully went to the Graph API, pulled my profile information using that bearer token. So that my intention here was to walk through this entire process manually. So when we get to using the MSAL.js library later, there's no mystery of what's going on underneath the hood. So this, you can actually build an application and do all this manually if you like. A really good example of this is I've done this multiple times with other OAuth applications using like IoT devices or smart home devices. I built all sorts of integrations with really cool stuff because I understood the flow. And that's really the key reason why I showed you how to do this manually. Now, going from there, this wouldn't be a great webinar if I didn't show you how to make your life easier. And that's where the Microsoft Authentication Library comes in. So the Microsoft Authentication Library is a set of SDKs for your favorite programming languages that allows you to access these APIs using these tokens that we just talked about, whether they're your APIs, the Microsoft provided APIs, third-party APIs, or even something like the Microsoft Graph. Now, I have a hyperlink at the top. I should have copied this. I'll try to put this in the chat real quick. I have PowerPoint open in another window to make my life a little bit easier. There we go. This hyperlink I just sent you will give you a much deeper overview of the MSAL library if you want to really get into it. But today we're going to use specifically MSAL.js. Now, MSAL.js is a great version of this library. It's ideal for JavaScript applications. You can use it in browser. You can use it with vanilla JavaScript applications, like you're building a Node server-side application. You can even use it in front-end frameworks like Angular. And they even have special NPM packages for different platforms if you want to use it in those platforms. But they also have the core Azure MSAL library for pretty much majority of use cases. Now, when we use that MSAL library, there's a couple things we need to know. The first thing we need to do is we need to build a user agent application. Now, this really is what helps us configure how we're going to sign in our users, whether we want to redirect them to a website or we want to do a pop-up window. It's our point of configuration for the entire application. So whether we're using, again, server-side applications or single-page web apps, that user agent application is going to be key to this. Now, how do we create one? Well, we use the MSAL.userAgent application. That's how we create a new instance. And then here I'm storing in a variable called client. Now, I could build upon this. For example, I can configure right here within the user agent application instance. So if I want to set up authorization, I just create an auth object. And within it, I have 3 properties: my client ID, my authority. That authority is going to look very familiar. That's pretty much the URL we use, login.microsoftonline.com/, and then you put your tenant information there, and then our redirect URI. So that configuration looks pretty similar. We can even set up cache. So if we wanted to store it as session or store it locally, we can cache people's authentication information in case we wanted to do silent authentication or some other mechanisms later. Once we configured that user agent application, we simply build a request. Now, there's different ways we can build a request, but for the purposes today, we just need to put our scopes in. So we're going to use user.read, and that will keep things pretty simple. So once we have our client set up and we've configured it with a request, we can log in interactively. The way we do that, client.login pop-up. We pass in that request object, and it's going to pop up a window and log in. Now, if you're already logged in, that pop-up window is going to not really show anything, but if you haven't logged in before, that's where the user will log in. And you see a lot of applications use these pop-up windows. If we wanted to get a token, then we just call acquire token silently, because at this point, we don't need to log in again. We just want to take the information that we already got from authentication and acquire the token. And you're going to find, especially in single-page web applications, that that's the common workflow you're going to use. Where you essentially start off by logging in interactively, and then you jump into acquiring a token. So let's actually jump in and take a crack at this. So I'm going to close out of PowerPoint one more time. And we're going to close, minimize Postman. We don't really need that for this demo. But what I have set up for you is I have a folder, Node Dev, and in here I have a really simple Node.js application. I've already npm installed. Excuse me. We already did npm install. We've already got our node modules down. We run an HTTP server. In HTTP server, we're hosting a really simple Bootstrap application with just a single button called Run Code. That's all it does. Click Run. And then here's our code that we actually run. So nothing super complicated here. I'm going to just run npm start. We're going to localhost 8080. And here's our application. I'm always nervous with demo code, but here we go. So we'll jump in, hit run code, and prints running. Nothing fancy here yet. Now we're going to really start to spice this up. So we're going to go in, go to portal.azure.com, and we're going to go to Azure Active Directory. And from Azure Active Directory, we're going to go to our app registration. And we have our example app registration we created earlier. Awesome. We're going to go to the authentication section. Now here we can configure platforms and stuff like that. Since this is a web application, and we've only set up the mobile and desktop platform, we need to set up a web platform. That's not too bad. I'll hit add a platform. I'm going to select web, and that needs a redirect URI. Luckily for me, localhost 8080 is a pretty good redirect URI. Now, I can also set up implicit grants. So this is required if our web application is going to get the access token itself. And that's actually what we're going to set up. We're going to assume this is a single page, our SPA app. So we're going to set up implicit grant, basically giving my application permission to go and grab its own authorization, go grab its own token. Everything's set up. So I'm going to go back into my code, and I'm going to start building this out. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my index.html file. I'm going to add a reference to the version of MSAL.js script we're going to use. I'm going to put this in the chat as an announcement, but I'm just going to pull it from CDN. So just show you where that looks like. This is the MSAL.js script I'm going to pull from the CDN, and I purposefully didn't use a minified version just in case you ever want to just go look at it. So I'm going to do up here in the header, script type text JavaScript. Of course, paste in that URL and then close my script tag. I don't know why that's capital S. It's because the first one was capital S. There we go. All right. Now I'm going to go to index.js, and I'm going to just start building out this code. So just like we saw in the slides, I'm going to create a constant, call it config. I'm going to create a auth property in here. First, I'm going to set up my client ID, go back to the portal, and go back to overview, and grab my client ID, paste that in. The next thing I'm going to set up is authority. Now that's https login.microsoftonline.com/common. Notice I'm using common this time instead of organizations. It's still going to work. I just wanted to try a different one. For my redirect URI, I'm going to set up to HTTP localhost 8080. And since I set it up in my application registration, it should work. I'm going to put a semicolon here. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my user agent application. So create a variable called client, new MSAL.user user agent application. Pass it in that config. I'm going to set up another variable called request. And here, I'm going to set up a property scopes. It's going to be an array of scopes. Today, we're just using user.read, so nothing too fancy. Then I'm going to set up the login. So client.login pop-up, just like we saw in the slide, pass it in my request. Now, I want to await this, and I want to put the response in a variable called login response. And we're going to print that out, login response. Remember, if I'm trying to type through this code a little slower, but if you ever want to look at the code, just go look at that GitHub repo we gave you at the top of the hour. And in there, you actually see all the code I'm walking through right now. So from here, I think I saved everything. Yep. I'm going to Control F5. And as long as I didn't break anything, and with my luck, sometimes I do break stuff, should load back up, make sure server's still running. That's all right. I'll bounce the server. There we go. Don't know what happened there. All right, gonna run my code. Now, since I've already logged in, you didn't see it, but actually a pop-up window showed up on one of my other screens. But it logged me in and got everything we need for me to go grab the token from the token endpoint. But I actually want to see that because otherwise this just looks like magic. I don't understand how it works. So I'm gonna do a couple fun things. The first thing I'll do is I'm gonna add a different scope. Mail.readWrite is one of the graph API scopes that allows you to actually manipulate your mail in exchange online. Now, I haven't given this application permission to use mail.readWrite before, so it should complain when the pop-up window comes up. So Control F5, run my code, and there's my pop-up window. It says, hey, I need permission to read and write access to your mail. Sure, you have my permission. And there we go. It does the login. Now, I'm going to go back to user.read because that's what we're going to demo today. But I can have fun with this. I'm going to take this localhost 8080, close this browser window, open up a new guest window where I haven't logged in yet. Go in, F12, run my code. And here, since I haven't logged in yet, I will have to log in. And since I already given it permission, it's returned my response back. Now we can build on this. So I'll go back to Visual Studio Code, and I have the login response, but just like when we did manual login, we need to go to the authorized endpoint to get the token. Well, luckily for us, I can just go let token response equals await client.acquire token silent. Pass it in my request. Same request. So console.dir token response. Now, since I've already logged in here, it doesn't need me to pop up another pop-up or log in again. This will be a silent acquisition. When you're building out a longer application, usually your first login will be interactive, and any logins after that will use the silent flow. So Control F5. Hopefully I didn't break anything. Fingers, toes crossed. There we go. I'm gonna hit run code. It popped up my window really fast. There's the information I got from login. But this time I also called acquire token silent and got information from there. You notice I now have an access token, and I can use that as a bearer token header to go in and have fun. Now, going back to aka.ms/ge, that's the Graph Explorer. I'm going to go back and sign in again. We went to the 1.0 me endpoint before, but I could actually switch to the beta version because it actually gives me a lot more information. Notice a much bigger JSON file here. This is exactly what I want to play with. So graph.microsoft.com/beta/me is what we're going to try to connect to. In order to do this, we need to use that token we got. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to call fetch. I'm going to go to that URL, and I need to set up my header because otherwise I won't be authenticated correctly. So I'll say headers, build an authorization header. And it's just simple string concatenation. So bearer token, capital B, space, left side. Then I'm going to take this token response. And when I looked at the browser window, it had a property called access token. So access token is what we're going to use here. Make sure my syntax all looks good. Okay, perfect. Now I want to await this fetch call. And I want to put it in a variable called payload. Now that I have the payload, I'm going to just turn it to JSON. So let JSON equals await payload.json. And I'm going to print that out, console.dir JSON. Save it. Go back, Control F5. Run my code again. Make sure I did everything correctly. I'm trying to make sure there's no typos here. All right, try it one more time. Run the code. Just double checking everything, make sure I didn't make any glaring mistakes. Let's just check the error call. Invalid authentication token is the error message I'm getting. Just to be absolutely sure, I'm going to copy and paste. Oh, there we go. I don't know if anybody in chat caught this. Headers, not headies, or whatever that was saying. This is why we do live demos. All right. Now we're gonna run the code one more time, and there's my profile information. I can use this to get other stuff from the graph. So, for example, if I wanted to get some of my mail, I can do that. It looks like it's graph.microsoft.com v1.0 me/messages. I can pop that in. But since mail requires different permissions, I need to change my scope. So it looks like here, for this one, it says I need to have either mail.read, mail.readWrite, or mail.readBasic. I'm going to keep this as simple as possible, so I'll use mail.readBasic. And I just have to remember that these aren't really case sensitive. So going to Control F5, run my code again. My pop-up window says, hey, read user basic mail. Yeah, sure, let's do it. Hit accept. There we go. There is my object. There's my email messages. I can see stuff like, is it read, reply to, sender. I can look at the body of it. Here's HTML content within the body. Lots of stuff I can do here. So this is part one, again, of our 4-part series. We're really going to go into how to use JavaScript with the Microsoft Identity Platform. In the next 3 parts of the series, we're going to talk about how to use this authorization token that we got here and go to other APIs. For instance, if we want to go to Azure Storage or we want to go to Azure Cognitive Services, as opposed to the Microsoft Graph. In another session, we're going to talk about the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, which actually encapsulates all this for you, so you can just drop in really useful web components that do handle the authentication and logging for you into existing applications, whether you want to put them in your own SPA applications or maybe integrate them into Office 365 custom apps you build. And then we also have another session in this series where we're going to go into the Graph SDK, which wraps up all of this. Instead of you having to learn where all the URLs are, it's a really useful API and a really useful SDK and library that makes it easy for you to query the graph and query different components on the graph. Really looking forward to seeing all those sessions. And what I'm going to do is I always like to hang out 5 or 10 minutes after we're done and just start answering some questions from the chat and Q&A. As always, if I miss your question or you feel like I didn't do a good job of answering your question, or you just have another question you thought of since we've had this session, msusdev@microsoft.com. I'm going to put that in the chat. And we also, lots of announcements we put in the channel, but essentially we're going to be doing our next sessions in Mixer. So come see us live. It's going to be nice and fun since it's in the Mixer. I'm terrified I'm going to have a demo bug, nice and live. But as you saw, we can recover. We'll have fun building this out and learning together. But again, msusdev@microsoft.com. If you got questions about the technical content, somehow you missed the Mixer links, or you're trying to figure out what the sessions are, feel free to reach out to us. I'm seeing some really good questions coming up in Q&A, so let's just jump in, answer what I can in Q&A. And if you don't have any questions or anything like that, thank you for attending. I'll see you in the next one. So just pause for a little while to review some of these Q&A questions. All right. Couple good questions in here. Well, lots of good questions in here. I'm gonna try to get everything I can, but it's a ton of questions, so I may miss your question. Again, blame it on my eyesight and my internet connection. All right, so somebody said, hey, MSAL, ADAL, what's the difference between them? How does that relate to ASP.NET Core Identity? We have a really good product team member who's actually on this call. She might be able to answer that question a little bit better. From my understanding, is using something else different. And I apologize. This is gonna sound super weird. I'm a .NET developer. I've worked with .NET for years. I've also worked with JavaScript for years. I've never used ASP.NET Identity before. OAuth has always been simple enough that I've either used third-party OAuth platform and library, or I just implemented the redirects myself. It's simple enough in ASP.NET to just redirect you to a website and then read the query string when you come back. So I've always manually implemented it, and that's mostly because I don't really use Entity Framework in some of those platforms. So ASP.NET Identity brought in a lot of extra stuff that I didn't want to add to my applications. So, but that's definitely a question that's worthy of send it to us at msusdev@microsoft.com. We can maybe connect you with somebody who can give you a better answer for that. Somebody says, hey, this workflow you just showed, does it work with live accounts? Yes, it does. So today I just showed you the organization's endpoint, but if we wanted to set it up and use an application, whether it's one we build ourselves or a third-party application that's using live accounts, we can totally set up using either the consumers tenant or some other configuration. And people can log in with their Microsoft Live accounts instead of with their organizational accounts. Somebody says, can we request multiple scopes in a single request? Yes, you can. You can definitely request more than one scope. That's why it's an array. I set it up with just a single scope just because it's a little simpler. When we go into our session on how to connect to Azure, you're going to see me start to use more than one scope, or you're going to see me use the .default scope for some services. And we'll talk much deeper about scopes because it's going to become really important. We start dealing with stuff that's not on a graph and doesn't have that simplified scope name. Somebody says, hey, we have multi-factor authentication. Is that going to mess with MSAL.js? Well, it's interesting because authentication, especially like MFA and some of the other things you may configure with Azure Active Directory, that's all handled on the Azure Active Directory side. So that's kind of one of the reasons why we're sending people to AAD to log in, because all the configuration, whatever we set up there is enforced there. And we don't have to change our application if our organization changes their identity policies. It's a good separation of concerns to have. Somebody says, hey, you showed authentication, but what if we wanted to do authorization? Like we wanted to check and see if they're part of an Azure AD group. If you look at the Microsoft Graph, you're actually going to notice a lot of this stuff that used to be on the Azure AD Graph is part of the Microsoft Graph now. So if you want to do something as simple as check out somebody's Azure AD group, you can still keep your authentication and authorization separate. They can authenticate, definitely use all the steps I showed you. But instead of going to the Microsoft Graph endpoints I showed you, you can go to the Graph endpoints that include metadata about your groups and other information like that, and then use that to perform authorization in your application. So the Graph Explorer, for those who are familiar with it, it's a really useful tool for you to learn how to work with the Microsoft Graph. When we have our session on the Graph SDK and the Graph itself, we're going to go much deeper into it. Somebody said, hey, what's an example if you want to use form post instead of query? It's only come up for me once before, and that's where we were redirecting to an application that already had another identity system set up. So they've already written all the parsing code for the form. So we just use form post instead of query. I'm pretty sure maybe somebody else on this call had it happen before, but I've never had like for a greenfield or new application, I've never had to use form post over query. Azure AD B2C, what's the differences? How do we change the code, or is it very much similar approach? There's a lot of stuff that's very similar if we're using Azure AD B2C. It's one of those things, if you're interested in seeing a session or webinar about that, send us an email at msusdev@microsoft.com. That's one of those that's such a edge case. I don't know if people really want to hear about that, but if people if people want to hear about it, send us an email. Flood our inbox. Help us help us plan for more sessions. All right, are there scenarios where MSAL doesn't cover, we need to use ADAL? Right now, just for most of the solutions we're working, we're so far along in the maturity trained that I haven't had a situation in the last year or so where I've had to have somebody use ADAL instead of MSAL, because most of the stuff that we used before is covered in the graph now, and then the identity endpoint is just OAuth 2. So it's not like there's new features in the OAuth 2 standard coming out. It's pretty much solid. It's pretty set. So any new application we're building MSAL. We don't even, ADAL is not even on the table as an option unless we're importing some legacy code and we're looking at it. And even then, you probably noticed from my diagram I showed, you can use MSAL to go to that 1.0 endpoint if you want. I'm not saying you have to, but if you absolutely have to, you want to, you could do it. Redirect versus pop-up. Pros, cons. 100% a function of your application and what you want to do. Your solution, if you're doing a single page application, maybe you don't want them to leave your single page application. Maybe you want to have a pop-up to authenticate. If you're doing a more of a traditional server-side application, redirect can make more sense in those scenarios. That's usually how I see it, but I know and I understand people on the internet see it completely different. All right, implications of doing this in JavaScript versus code behind. There's definitely some things you want to think about, especially with like distributing your client ID. You want to protect those type of credentials. With code behind, obviously, it's a little bit easier for you to protect your credentials. If you go to Microsoft Identity Platform documentation, it's actually an article that talks about with single page applications how you can keep your credentials secret. Somebody says, hey, does the redirect preserve forum post data, or do we need to save the forum post in state and then redirect to login.microsoft.com? In my experience, I've had to actually just save the forum state and then redirect. I don't know if that's changed recently. If I'm wrong about that, somebody could jump in and correct me, but in the past, I've actually had to save it. Okay, somebody says, hey, we want to impersonate a user, but we don't really want to hard code their password. Can we do that? If you look at the Microsoft Identity Platform documentation, there's a page on the different authentication flows. There's actually an on behalf of flow, and there's unattended flows. Look at those documentation pages. It's going to actually talk about the scenario you're describing, especially in unattended scenarios or service scenarios where you really don't want to hard code a password. I saw a couple more questions around .NET. I highly encourage, if you have a .NET question, come on down to our sessions in July where we're going to be talking about, we're going to walk through the same thing, but in .NET instead of JavaScript. So if you see a lot of really good .NET questions, come on down. We'll be here. We're really excited to hear from everybody. We're going to wrap things up today, but again, you've all been a great audience. I'm really glad to really share this information with you. I really look forward to see you all on our Mixer Farewell Tour for identity development. Thank you all again.